welcome to the Ethics and Public Policy Working Group. My name is Doug McKay, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Public Policy at UNC Chapel Hill. And Christian Preiss is the co-director of the group at the University of Florida. And we're very happy to host an Author Meets Critics on Joshua Preiss's excellent book, Just Work for All, which I hope everyone's had a chance to look at, or at least read some of the excerpts that we've sent around. So the way we're going to run this, Josh is going to speak for about 10 minutes and just give a little bit of an overview of the book. And then we have three critics, Jonathan Wolff, Suresh Naidu, and Ryan Muldoon. And then Josh will finish up with some replies in about 10 minutes to their feedback, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A. So I'll turn things over to Josh.
Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I want to, before I give I have 10 minutes to give an overview of the book, and I'm going to talk for a minute before that, so I got 9 minutes afterwards. But I'd love to thank Joe and Suresh and Ryan for coming. I was telling my son about this, about 50 people in the world who I would most like to get comments on my book for, and I've got 3 of them here to come to my Author Meets Critics. So I'm delighted to hear more about what you think, particularly if it's positive. But so thank you so much for taking the time to read the book and for coming. Thanks to Doug and the folks at the Ethics and Public Policy Working Group for hosting the event. And thank you all for coming. And for those of you who are registered who will watch the video later. And for those of you who bought the book, it goes to a good cause. I've worked with Routledge here, and for each copy purchased, $1 will go to my kids' college funds. So you can feel pretty good about the effective altruism of your purchasing decisions. So okay, so I'm just going to say, rather than give try and give a complete summary, I'm going to highlight 3 features of the book, and I know in the comments a lot more will probably come up, and hopefully some of you had a chance to read the book, or at least the introduction I shared. First, it's a decidedly PPE book. It's a book which takes insights from at least those 3 disciplines. Spends a fair amount of time with economic history, some with sociology as well. And I think of it as an integrated PPE book, and not just borrowing these things, but I'm making some claims about how these disciplines fit together and can inform each other. Claims which might be controversial. It might be the subject of some of our discussion today. It's a PPE book, and it also has the politics P in it. Sometimes work in PPE can be can kind of not talk too much about that politics P, to be honest. Think about politics in terms of just political institutions, and then we put analytic models from economics and philosophy together and see what we got. And often that work is extremely fruitful and interesting, but this work has more engagement with political science and sociology literature, including claims about what people actually believe in a certain context and why that might be important. So there's a little discussion about my sense of public philosophy and how it's different than Rawls. There's some claims about the negative externalities of trying to put a public policy into effect in a context where people have certain beliefs or where there is a political culture. And the book, although it's not the focus, offers something of a theory of politics too. So I try and say something about a plausible set of coalitions that could get behind the reforms I'm talking about. And in fact, this politics says something about which principles we ought to prioritize and why in certain contexts. Okay. A central distinction in the book is a distinction between a Smithian well-ordered society and a winner-take-all society. And now these are not meant to be just or radically unjust models, all things considered, but I use these 2 sort of concepts to do 2 things in particular. One, to organize a giant sort of range of data and economics, political economy, economic history about the transformation of evolution of American society, particularly in the last half century. But I also use it to talk a bit about the relevance of political and economic context to the theory and practice of justice. But very briefly, a Smithian Well-Ordered Society, or SWO, is a society with rapid growth, with widely shared gains from that growth, such that even ordinary, relatively unskilled workers could expect, I'm looking down at the definition here, even though I've talked about this 25 times, I'm still looking down at my notes, interestingly, could expect a better life for themselves and their families. A winner-take-all society, by contrast, is one with slower growth, rising inequality, and declining absolute mobility, and with that declining hope that through hard work, one could find a better life for themselves and their children. So the rest of the book then thinks about what the theory and practice of justice might need to entail or should entail or prioritize if societies move from SWO to WTA. And broadly speaking, I think many societies are becoming less rapidly growing, less inclusively growing. And so I think this distinction doesn't map perfectly, but captures something about the evolution of many societies, in particular, the United States. Now, with this distinction or transformation in mind, then, I look at a number of different aspects of justice, but for my little intro here, I'm going to talk about the distinction between two widely held principles of equality and opportunity in the American context, which I try to capture by using the terms fair race and just work. So fair race is a principle of justice, is a broadly meritocratic principle, where justice is served when people have a fair chance at achieving positions of privilege or esteem, or just the things that they most want and need to live a well-lived human life. Just work is more of a relational principle, concerns the dignity of work and those who perform it. In particular, the idea that people should be able to exchange hard work for at least a middle-class life. A middle class here being a context-dependent normative standard, by contrast with, say, middle income. It includes such basic goods as education and healthcare and the share of the fruits of economic growth. So one of my central arguments then is that as societies move further and further from SWO to WTA, again, a Smithian Well-Ordered Society to a winner-take-all society, they have more and more reason to give greater attention to just work and to prioritize that in terms of their politics and policy. And more so than that, even people who think that fair race is basically all that justice is, right? A fair chance or an equal opportunity or a level playing field or some conception like that, have reason to further just work, even to think about policies which further just work, to adopt a politics behind just work. And even people who are fundamentally concerned with racial and gender disparities, right? Something which seems to say little about overall productivity growth or better life, but instead the inequality of opportunity. Even those people have reason to give priority to just work. In SWO, it makes sense to focus for both political philosophers and political actors to focus on inequalities of opportunity, identifying and combating deep inequalities of opportunity. A politics maybe that focuses on educational opportunity, equality, or non-discrimination. But as societies move closer to WTA, then the priorities need to be different. And again, this includes those who are focused on inequality between groups. For example, for African Americans, chapter 4 of the book talks about racial justice in the American context. It's one of the central things for thinking about racial justice, which is often lacking in American public discourse of racial justice, is the extent to which these political and economic trends, this movement towards WTA, is swamping many of the gains in legal and political recognition and many of the educational gains, such that Black-white income and wealth disparities are larger than they were before the Civil Rights Act, right? One way of thinking about this is just a fundamental failure of recognition over time, but I suggest that it really gives us reason to prioritize just work. More generally, the politics of WTA threatens many of the gains of the past century. More than that, it threatens liberal and democratic institutions. So even those who believe that competition is all that matters for justice have reason to give priority to just work. That is, to adopt a policy and political and policy goal of maintaining an economy that liberally rewards work and where economic growth enables widespread gains to wealth, health, leisure, and security. And I'll talk one more minute, Doug, and then I'll move on to the critics. And this is true even again for people who who might think that equality of opportunity or fair race is all that justice is. And one of the reasons why, and this is kind of a little quickie example to illustrate some of the stuff that happens in the book, is that the politics of winner-take-all societies militate against the economics of winner-take-all society militate politically against the institutions that make fair race possible. For example, is the fruits of economic growth are increasingly concentrated, is the stakes of winning or losing the race become greater. Parents, for example, have all the more reason to hoard opportunities in the context of a winner-take-all society. Whereas a society where the fruits of economic growth are more widely shared, it's easier for people, including people who think fair race is all that justice is, to live and support policies that are most consistent with those values. In other words, this is sort of one of the lurking things in the book, is that people are not just people, but rather the nature of people. Their motivations can vary a lot by political and economic institutions, and a focus on just work in a society and a set of politics and policy that bring about more inclusive prosperity will be, in a way, self-reinforcing by making it easier for people to continue to further and favor just institutions. Okay, that's a kind of introduction. Thank you again, everyone, for coming, and I'm very excited to see what everyone has to say.
Great, so we'll turn things over now to Jonathan Wolff.
Thanks very much, Doug. And Josh, thanks so much for inviting me to do this. We were, I think, planning at some point to do it live in person, which would have been wonderful, but this is a pretty good substitute, I think. And it's great to see the people here, and look forward to their comments too, and also your response. So just to start, so I greatly admired this book. If you have had a chance to read it, I'm sure you will have admired it too. It's full of philosophical insights. It's plausible. It's highly readable. And that is a very rare combination. Getting one of those three things is quite unusual. Getting insight, plausibility, and readability, I think, is close to unique, particularly in philosophy. Josh has already brought out the key contrasts in the book, and this is one of the things I think hadn't struck me before, which is the contrast between what is called in the book the Smithian Well-Ordered Society and the winner-takes-all society. And whether or not this is the idea, I think we can think of these almost as the Smithian Well-Ordered Society is the type of ideology of capitalism. That is, if you play by the rules, you work hard, you can get a good life. Whereas the winner-takes-all is the reality of capitalism, that a very small number of people will get extremely rich, and the rest of us will be scrabbling around for what we can. And a winner-take-all society implies that there are many people who are losers in the competitive and in the Trumpian sense of that phrase. So the American dream is to try to bring out the ideology, make the ideology reality, to try to create a world in which we do have the Smithian well-ordered society. So I agree with a lot of the book. I learned a lot, so I'm going to be making criticisms, but because I agree with the book, these are as much self-criticisms as criticisms of Josh, so I'd be interested to see how we go with them. So a way of fleshing out, at least for me, the idea of the Smithian well-ordered society, what does it promise an individual? Well, it promises the individual more or less what I had, which I think I'm in the generation known as the sort of tailgate of the boomers, the last of the boomers. So what does that mean? Well, I got a job and we struggled a bit, but with my wife's salary and my own salary, we managed to get a mortgage on a place to live, minimal family help, some family help, but not significant amounts. We could buy a car, we had education, cheap education, healthcare we didn't pay for, we could raise a family, we could take holidays, and have a pretty much a good life. My son, who's 30 years old, can't do that. he will never be able to buy a house in London on salary. It's just not plausible given salaries and house prices now. What about my parents? Well, they're about the first British generation that could do that. What's interesting to me is that their parents couldn't, and their grandparents probably couldn't. And so what this makes me think is that, so forgive me, Josh, what I feel we've got here is like a progressive version of Make America Great Again. You know, that the idea that there was this good time that we were promised in the past, or a way of living our life that we were promised in the past. And it's certainly true that people have been able to do that, because I have, and my parents did. I'm sure similar things happen in the US. But I think what I'm very interested in is the slightly longer term comparison, because I think it's very common, particularly among people on the left, to say sort of the 1950s roughly is the benchmark, the 50s or 60s is a benchmark, and it's all been downhill from there. But there's another way of thinking about it that says, well, that period between the 50s and maybe the 80s, that was the exception, not the rule. And the rule has been something actually much more like what we have now. So if you think about the US, the 1920s and 30s were not a good time for ordinary people to be living in. The 1910s weren't, the 1900s weren't. When was? And then if we think about what did happen in between the 50s and the 80s, if that's the right time, maybe up to the 90s, who was living this good life? Well, there's a chapter in the book about race in America. This good life was predominantly lived by white Americans, male Americans. And so what it makes me wonder is not only who could live the American dream, but at what cost, and particularly what cost in terms of injustice. So to expand, first of all, on this point about the possible exceptionalism of the 50s to the 80s, there's a very interesting book by Walter Seidel, I think, or Walter Seidel, sorry, I'm forgetting his name, called The Great Leveler. And he argues in a great historical sweep, not unlike Piketty, that the natural tendency of society, not just capitalism, is towards inequality. So if we let things go, inequality increases. But he says there are 4 types of things that will historically have significantly reduced inequality. And these are not good to hear. So state collapse, for example, plague, revolution, and war. Now, war is really interesting, particularly in the context of the 20th century. And the reason why war reduces inequality is that war has to be paid for. You have to pick up the pieces afterwards. And the only people who can pay for it are those with money, the wealthy. And so after the Second World War, I mean, it's incredible to think about it now, but in the UK, the highest marginal tax rate we had was 98%. So there were people who were paying 83% income tax and a super tax of 15% on unearned income. So if you were very wealthy, you were paying 98% on shared dividends. How is that tolerable? In the US, I believe there was also a 90% tax rate. So I think people thought this was a price of reconstruction. Society had been devastated. We're going through a crisis. And so we have at this historical period, both the sense that we've got to rebuild society and a post-war boom. But not everyone got rich on that, or not everyone even had the benefit from the Smithian Well-Ordered Society. So there was probably racial injustice in the United States during that time. There was gender injustice. There was certainly global injustice. If you think about the relative living standards of people in the US to the rest of the world, incredible differences, which are still there. But also probably climate injustice as well. So there was a huge use of energy, and that is putting costs on future generations. So what I wonder is whether, and this doesn't really affect the analysis of the book, but it affects a thought of what should we be wishing for? What is realistic to wish for now within the limits of justice? Because it seems to me very unrealistic to think that the wealthy societies can go back to the type of living standard they had for the middle classes before the period of the winner-take-all society. Now, that might be wrong. I mean, the diagnosis of the book, I think, is that the reason why the American dream is not livable at the moment is because of the winner-take-all society. And I don't know whether that's true. It might be true, but I'm also thinking that the reason it's not livable is that it's not morally acceptable anymore to have the forms of exploitation that allow that level of wealth. Now, it's probably complicated, there's more than one thing, but what this would mean is we might want to be thinking about new ways of imagining what a good life would be, which is not the same as the good life that we've had for the latter part of the 20th century. Maybe we need a new model of what the American dream or any dream should be. Okay, so I've had my 10 minutes. It went unbelievably quickly, I think. And so I'll pass back to you, Doug. Thanks very much for listening.
All right, wonderful. So we'll turn things over to Suresh and Naidu.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone. I'm probably going to be an outlier here in that I can't actually talk publicly without slides. It's like I've been cultured to do this, so I'm going to just kind of use some slides to organize my thoughts. Sorry. Okay, so I had a great time reading this book. It's rich, it's engaging, it's erudite, it's bringing philosophy into dialogue with both positive social science, with contemporary policy debates, with history of thought, and so it's very fun to read and think about. And you'll sort of, I have like lots of things scribbled in margins. So I very much appreciated it, even as an economist, as a non-philosopher. I got a lot out of it. So I'm just going to kind of take one entry point into the book and sort of talk about it, where the book kind of builds out a kind of a view of like American public philosophy, kind of a sort of set of ideas that are held broadly in the American sort of public discourse. And you know, the two ideas are the fair race and just work. And the fair race is roughly like, I think, a meritocratic position where it's that we should make sure that everyone has like level the playing field, but then let talent rip. And I think that's like underplayed in the book, is how much that American view involves also the letting the talented rip. Is the Americans think, you know, Jay-Z deserves every dollar he has because he's like a super talented person, or that certain superstars do in fact deserve. Wilt Chamberlain deserves every dollar that he gets. By the way, no one ever criticizes Nozick for talking about how much the 76ers actually owners took from Wilt Chamberlain. It's a good story to tell. It's like Chamberlain couldn't quit his job because of the structure of the NBA at the time. It's a good and then the other ideal is just work, which is that I'm going to characterize this as I sort of thought to understand it from my reading, was that it was a reasonable amount of work ought to be sufficient for a standard of living that enables standing, social reproduction, what we'll sort of think of as a middle class level. But the idea is that both of these are rooted in American tradition. But I think, as Jonathan suggested, it's like who wrote that tradition is not kind of like an unbiased sample of American political thinking, and kind of, you know, there's a good tradition of immanent critique in it, and say, you know, Black radicals or feminists. And what's I think interesting is that there's an immanent critique of that tradition, but there's also like an external critique of that tradition, and so it'd be interesting to sort of think about this book in dialogue with that, with the external critiques of that. And I think right now it's handling the immanent critiques of it, but and then the book uses these ideas to critique outcomes in these winner-take-all market economies. But I want to sort of suggest that, like, if you actually just took these ideas as sort of given, I don't think they're inconsistent with the winner-take-all world if you just have this belief that talent is rare. Like if you actually think that there's a super small share of like really gifted people in the world, then you know create you know, you need to find those people. You need to find the lost Einsteins that are you know prevented from reaching their potential. But then once you find them, you should like you know give them all the resources in the world and let them bestow enormous goods on the rest of us. And in particular, if the goods that they provide are complementary to the work of the less talented, then you can sort of implement just work along with fair race in a winner-take-all economy. And so all you need to do is get the smart people to make the machines that make the rest of us that are not smart, useful workers, and you know we're good. So there's nothing in that that feels really like inconsistent with this winner-take-all society. In some ways, it's like an ideology that could be very readily adopted to justify the outcomes in a winner-take-all economy. So I just you know thought if I sort of went with that reading of this, could I get actually a pretty good defense of winner-take-all. Another sort of question I sort of came up with is, why is just work relational? And it's a claim that sort of is made a couple of times in the book, but the definition given is a distributional one, not a relational one. It's something about the mapping between, you know, inputs and outputs in the economy, and then there's a tie that says that it's something about our relationship with each other and our relationship to citizens. But I didn't sort of see how a distributional definition mapped into a relational definition, and maybe I missed it, and I thought like it wasn't sort of capturing, you know, what one of the features I think we think of the relational component of equality is just, you know, my ability to just say no, and that it was kind of like sort of still anchored in the, you know, if I submit sufficiently to the authority of an employer and that should be enough to get enough income. I just didn't see how it connected to a relational definition. And again, like the word dignity is used a lot here, but I'm not sure if dignity is kind of tautologically kind of defined as the thing that makes sufficient, or if there's like an independent definition of dignity that is at play here. I've sort of come at this from like a sort of like a game theoretic perspective on dignity in some ways, of like thinking about it as these second order beliefs. It's that like this belief that other believe that what I do is valuable. And so if I'm doing something that I think, it doesn't even have to be true. It's just that it has to be that I think that it's true. And that the key question is which others are relevant. And when it's like the others in a large anonymous market, income is actually like a really great credible signal of that social value. It's like, I'm paid a decent wage, I'm paid a considerable sum of money. And so, you know, I can't be doing something that's so useless because somebody's paying me for it. And so that like kind of affirms this sense of my value, because I'm you know, however distorted the market signal is, somebody cares about what I'm doing. But there's other ways of credibly signaling that social value of work. So how we organize childcare with our within families or even across families in terms of you know, watching each other's kids, or how we think about jury duty or military service. There's like other ways we organize, you know, doing unpleasant things because others value them. You know, we can kind of think about organizing these differently, or we can think about not just using income alone as a signal of that social value. We can think of other tools. So I have I'll kind of go with a few other thoughts. Sort of came up to me. It's like, do we actually have the policy tools to reshape winner take all? So I think it's like more than the technology and more than anything about monopolies or any of the particular features of an economy. Here's a wonder I have, which is, it's more Weberian than anything else. It's just like, as we get really large and complicated, we wind up with these large hierarchical organizations. And because they're hierarchical, there's fewer people at the top of them than there are at the bottom of them. And that very and then the fact that they're large means that there's a lot of layers in that tree, and that two sort of properties of many layers and a few at the top is going to generate an enormous amount of inequality. And it's not something about markets or superstars per se. And it's because it's like why are CEOs paid so much? It's because they're sitting on top of companies that are gigantic and they're hierarchical. And so they're paid an enormous amount of money, justified or not justified, by virtue, I think, of the kinds of organizations that they're running and the kinds of organizations that our economy and society currently have. So I think curbing this more basic feature of like, how do we keep compressed differences within large hierarchical organizations is kind of a precursor to undoing this kind of winner take all thing. It's more an organizational thing than a technological thing. It's kind of my point there. Where does pre-distribution versus redistribution fit in here? And so towards the end, I was kind of wondering, like, why should we prefer or not prefer the minimum wage to like the earned income tax credit, for example, so in the US? And you know, in my little part of economics, there's kind of like an active debate over like the minimum wage versus the earned income tax credit. And the earned income tax credit, I think, like Oren Cass is a big fan of it because it's like it's a subsidy to the just work standard. It's basically a tax policy that lets you implement the just work standard. But then there's also like a minimum wage. That's another way of implementing a just work standard, you could think. And so the one question I had is like, what is the reason why we should, or is there anything about why we should prefer implementing this via pre-tax and transfer policies, or is there a reason that we should be okay with implementing it via like tax and transfer policies? I mean, you could imagine designing a tax code that was exactly consistent with the earlier two principles, and it would be like the earned income tax credit plus some form of like tax breaks and affirmative action according to parents' income, and that would be like a rough and ready tax code that would implement kind of both of those principles. But the book, I feel like the overall tone comes down on pre-distribution, and I'm sort of curious about like why, and I'll give you some evidence on why I think it's why. And then my last smaller point is just like I admire the book for kind of stepping down from the lofty heights of philosophy and actually getting into the muck of politics and thinking about the political coalitions that could do stuff. But it's, you know, if you just look around, the basic problem is that we just don't actually have a we. And the last chapter has a lot of like, we should do this, we should do that. I'm like, who is this we that's like a fantastical creature that could actually do anything? Feels like there's like a big missing question of the we. And if you sort of think about the role of this American public philosophy, I think it helped hold together a coalition of American elites that sustained American institutions. In some ways, that like coalition of elites is like broken down. And so it's not clear that public philosophy is able to do the job that it once did of holding together like the ruling class in some ways, in some sort of like agreement about American democracy. And so perhaps this is the role for like philosophy, is actually we need to hold together this new coalition. But then I was like kind of wondering, can we actually do that on the basis of this old American public philosophy? So I just want to sort of end with my epistemological safe space, which is data sets, and sort of present some evidence about why this is just some work I'm doing currently about when you have to just explain the Brahmanification of the left in both the US and the UK. This is survey data going back to the 1940s, and this is the differences in educational support for redistribution and pre-distribution. And it turns out, like, you know, the only people that really like taxes and transfers are college educated people. When you ask people without a college degree what kinds of policies that they want, the overwhelming thing, actually, the thing that's most consistent is provide jobs for all. And that goes back to the 1940s, is that like less than college educated respondents have kind of always consistently supported a kind of jobs guarantee. And, you know, they're also in favor of unions and minimum wages and protectionism. But I feel like the jobs guarantee is kind of a policy that I was like kind of skeptical of before seeing the survey data, but just sort of seeing how consistently popular it has been among those with a college degree has just kind of got me thinking about it as like a useful thing. And that's my last slide, is that, you know, in sort of thinking about what a 21st century jobs guarantee along with this just work thing is sort of make me thinking of, is that, you know, there's a funny way in which, if you actually look at the data, we kind of have this like slow trend towards increasing leisure. It's just all taken in old age. Like our life expectancies have gone way up while the retirement ages have stayed at 65. So we're actually a lot closer to Keynes's 15-hour work week than we thought. We're just taking it at the end of life. And so, but this additional leisure is not showing up as a great deal of flourishing. And so I think there's like a real world reason for policy and politics to kind of go back and sort of say like, well, actually, we're going to take some sort of claims on your time, and that those claims on your time and your work, you know, there's plenty of things that we need doing. So, you know, caring labor to provide it at a both like a fair wage and at a level that people can afford necessarily requires a public subsidy. Like it's just, otherwise it's not fiscally sustainable. But a kind of more radical idea, I guess, is that like thinking about structuring the economy and particularly the labor market to help the democracy work better. And so imagine that we sort of actually thought about like, what would it take to the kinds of real concrete allocations of time and resources it would take to get a we that could actually govern again. And maybe that entails like paying for the work of democratic governance. So implementing sortition, for example, where we like kind of have much more in the way of like random groups coming together to make decisions, but we're paying for people's time. We pay for people's time to do a jury's duties. Maybe we even implement like poll subsidies, where we're literally saying like, if you vote, here's like here's a check. And the idea is that we want to actually reward the sacrifice and effort it takes into participating in democratic governance, and that's something that maybe helps us get back to a we. And I'll stop there. I probably went over, but I can see the clock. Sorry.
All right, thanks very much, Suresh.
Oh, I did go over. Sorry.
You're fine. Our last critic is Ryan Muldoon.
Okay, thanks very much. So I really enjoyed this book, and I would like to kind of emphasize what a cool PPE book this is. This is really an effort at really integrated thinking across a number of disciplines and really taking the engagement seriously to think about a complex set of social issues. So I think this is a really great model for how to try to do cool work in political philosophy and PPE more broadly. So I think I agree with everyone so far that this is a really interesting effort to try to extract a kind of an American consensus of what just institutional arrangements would look like. And this is sort of a sketch of what like a New Deal would look like. And I think that's an exciting project. I'm going to go through some of these first slides more quickly because it's kind of well-covered territory. You know, Josh builds out this Smithian Well-Ordered Society as a kind of economic ideal that we may or may not have been in before, and argues that we've shifted towards a winner-take-all society where there's fewer winners, more inequality, and more sources of inequality. This generates kind of dysfunctional behaviors like opportunity hoarding, structural bottlenecks to prosperity, and kind of outsized gains to fewer and fewer people. So we developed these two principles for thinking through just states of affairs, a fair race kind of approach that makes more sense in a Smithian Well-Ordered Society as a point of emphasis, and just work, which is more relevant in the winner-take-all kind of society. And then a lot of the book is supporting the idea that we've shifted from a Smithian Well-Ordered Society towards something that looks a lot more like a winner-take-all kind of society. And this should give us reason to favor a just work kind of principle. In these middle chapters, Josh gives us a whole bunch of interesting institutional reforms to consider to try to re-support a just work principle. And these aren't kind of pulled from a hat, rather he goes at length into various evidence for why these would be good kinds of policies. So roughly grouped, he suggests things like land taxes, weakened IP protections for tech and biotech, government production of digital goods, a much more aggressive unionization effort, sectoral bargaining, co-determination for kind of thinking about labor, more place-based policies, a lot more infrastructure investment, and then things like federal wage subsidies, nationalized health insurance, and a sovereign wealth fund that pays dividends to citizens. So these are all efforts, I take it, to kind of shift us towards a more just work sort of framework. And so here's where I'll kind of get into some pushback. And I think a chunk of what I have to say here aligns well with Joe's comments. So first, I think a lot of the book is showing that we have shifted, but not really how. I'd be really interested in seeing more of a model for the mechanisms by which this transition took place, and whether this was, for instance, just a consequence of economic globalization and technological shifts. Is it a series of unjust political actors making, strategic moves in legislation or in the management of large firms or something like this? Is it a failure of democratic rule? What is it that we can point to that caused this unspooling? And the thing that I might want to emphasize along with Joe is that I think the mid-20th century was both an anomaly and also probably not a good model. So it's an anomaly in the sense that the 50s, 60s is massively a period of most of the productive capacity of the industrialized nations was bombed out. This was a period of rapid catch-up growth from places that kind of had it. And then the United States was sort of uniquely both feeding Europe and producing most of the complex manufactured goods. This is an unusual situation, not one that I would hope to recreate ever again. And so just that part, that very rapid economic expansion is from a situation of immense misery and devastation that I don't think we can kind of happily recreate. But let's ignore the kind of bombed out part and think about how a lot of that growth happened. Well, in the United States, we had this boom of home ownership, but only for white people. Essentially, federally backed mortgages were only for mortgages in white neighborhoods. So we had kind of mandated at the federal level segregation. We built out a highway system, cutting through neighborhoods with people that had lacked political voice, racial minorities. We increased the use of industrial chemicals at a very large scale that generated huge cancer clusters. We basically accidentally weaponized lead in the form of tailpipe emissions, knocking new estimates say around 5 IQ points off of the average American, and all kinds of other stuff that we're now paying the bill for, essentially. So we were having all these debts off books, and now we're putting them back on the ledger. And some of those effects are shaping our current political economy in fairly serious ways. And the institutions that we developed to deal with them are now, in some ways, holding us back from making smart moves. But like one example that I think is useful to think about here is, so in the contemporary United States, we often talk about difficulty of providing good public educations and the cost of doing so, and the difficulty of providing excellent healthcare to people. A non-trivial reason for the change here is in the 50s, we could get a massive implicit subsidy on education and healthcare because educated women could be teachers or nurses and didn't have access to other professions in a very serious way. And so we got to pay them poorly and take advantage of the fact that this was the option that they had. We still want to pay those positions not so much, but now women thankfully have a much wider range of options available to them in the workforce. And so we see challenges there. Our recovery from kind of massive shifts and kind of lack of political equality has major consequences for the fact that in lots of areas of life, we no longer have these kind of implicit subsidies on the back of very serious exploitation that we now have to figure out how to have sustainable growth while we're treating people more equally. So the other thing that I think that I haven't heard so far from the other commentators is insofar as we want to try to return to, say, a Smithian Well-Ordered Society, or approach it at least, what does that look like in a dynamic sense? Not just at a moment in time, what is a good distribution, but a big thing in the book that comes up repeatedly is the cost of slower growth. As we turn down the rate of economic expansion, we see opportunity hoarding. We see all these people trying to get the minimal gains that they can. So this suggests fast growth is important. How do we do that in a way that kind of still supports something like a just work kind of principle, especially when for kind of just bare descriptive reasons, a lot of things in the economy seem to have serious agglomeration effects, whether that's technology firms or whether that's the productivity of cities based on the agglomeration of human capital, or whether that's kind of regional effects of different industry classes that have differential productivity rates, kind of like slurping up talent. Another question that I didn't really see seriously thought through is whether a Smithian Well-Ordered Society is an open society in the sense of kind of admitting global trade and free flows of people. So is this compatible with like immigrant flows and being one of many countries engaged in a global economy, or is this a more closed society? You know, some of those agglomeration effects are more prominent because we're in a more globalized society, but that has benefits at raising the absolute level of the bottom. So it might generate inequality while it's giving us absolute gains. And then the last thing I want to kind of pull out here is, should we be focusing on distributive considerations, or do we want to also be focusing on productive considerations? So I would like to see more discussion of how is it that we get more of the stuff that we want. You know, we can talk about government subsidy or infrastructure development, things like that, but a reason we see less of that now is, in the United States context at least, it's ludicrously expensive. It's over the top expensive to build a subway line. It's something like $5,000 just to check to see if a house has a lead water line going to it. We can't scale things up to solve the removal of lead service lines if each time we're just checking, let alone replacing them, it's on the order of $5,000. That just slurps up too much resources. So how can we think about driving down the costs of facilitating or living a good life? And then some of the recommendations that Josh was suggesting kind of cut both ways. So, you know, if we say weaken IP protections or something like that, that's also like taking a hammer to one of the more productive aspects of the American economy. So what is it that we want to kind of preserve as we're making these shifts? So one statistic I saw recently that struck me is the city of Boston receives more initial investment in businesses than all of the UK. Silicon Valley receives more initial business investment than Canada, Europe, and Latin America combined. These are kind of, I would say, good-making features of the American economy and a signal of massive productivity and dynamism. Lots of new firm startups are thanks to previous generations of immigration policy that in the past, say, decade we've moved away from. What is it that we want to look like? And how is it that we have a dynamic economy that is based around a growing sense of civic respect and political equality that still embodies some of these things that is, I think, too often thought of as purely distributional considerations instead of a question of growth and production and some account of dynamism. So I'll stop there, but I just want to reinforce that this is a really cool book. It has a lot of really great ideas in it. And I think this is kind of a really productive path forward for kind of jumpstarting a literature in this kind of non-ideal theory area of thinking, how can we do better? So I want to applaud Josh for that. All right, thanks very much.
Great. So we'll turn things back, and Josh will answer all of the criticisms that have been.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for the comments. Way too much interesting stuff for me to address in 10 minutes, really in a half an hour. So I'm going to kind of read my notes that I've taken here, and hopefully it falls together pretty well. One set of comments, which I'm going to kind of deal with sort of quickly, is so it's a very hopeful book, and it's a book that's meant to appeal to an audience which may never read it. Yeah, I say in the acknowledgments, I'm writing it for an audience that I'm sort of willing into existence, including policymakers who are, would be interested in this kind of a work, and including my, fellow citizens including people like my family who, don't have a college degree, and hopefully they can relate to it. It is a hopeful book, and everybody has, of course, provided reasons I'm well aware of to not be hopeful, about the politics of just work and about how effective a policy of just work. I'm very comfortable with, and in fact, I feel like it's there in the book, recognizing that the mid-20th century America is not an ideal for a wide range of reasons, and it may not be achievable. It may be unique. You could have this economic history version of why it's unique in terms of which forms of innovation and productivity growth can lead to this rapid productivity growth, and you can have these sort of the post-devastation story, which I think is broadly correct. All of these things can be true, and it still is the case that we need to rethink then our principles of justice, either what they mean in practice or how we prioritize them, to a situation which is very different than this mid-century economy, right? So my insights there don't really go away if the mid-century economy is not an ideal in a variety of ways, or if it's not achievable in a variety of ways. It just underlines the point that in order to do it, we're going to have to do it differently than we did before, and we, in many ways, should do it differently than before. And I think that that's all in the book, but that's something worth emphasizing. All right, so what's my next note? Oh, Suresh, letting the talented rip. It's interesting. When I first started thinking about these topics, I was spending my sabbatical year at Brown, and I had a conversation with Greg Menkew about this. Now I'm going to lump you with Greg Menkew. We'll see how you feel about that pairing. But he said, well, people don't really care that Robert Downey Jr. is rich, and I'm like, well, yeah, people don't really care that Robert Downey Jr. is rich, or that Wilt Chamberlain. Well, they don't know who Wilt Chamberlain. Jay-Z is rich or whatever, but they do. I think, I'm convinced by the social scientific data, broadly think that something's gone wrong here. They do broadly think that a society where inequality is fine as long as you can think of those at the top as either being superstars in that kind of a sense, or that, again, there's a kind of rising tides for everybody. When they tend to feel very differently about, say, George Soros or various financial rent seeking, they tend to feel differently about a variety of other things that the actor, superstar actor, sports star doesn't really capture. But I think you're right. I mean, in a strictly superstar economy WTA sense, I think that economics is broadly consistent with a just work society if all sorts of things are done in response to it. So I think you could make that. How is just work relational? This is a good question. It's an interesting question for me in part, and when I view this book in the context of my other work. I mean, in one sense, it's a relational in the sense that, you know, the standard is the pride and place and dignity of workers, right? And people's sense of self and people's sense of the value of workers is related to who finds them valuable. And there's an interesting set of questions as to who counts as peers and what matters for that. But broadly speaking, that tends to work out better when I think I'm convinced when it is a more inclusive prosperity. And there is a extended section on power and domination and the relationship between just work and power and domination in the book. I don't spend as much time about it as I might like, which is, you know, I see a number of people here who I've engaged with on other topics. I mean, I frequently write about power and domination in markets and how it's relevant. So it's interesting to kind of to see someone reading the book is not seeing that necessarily as much there, and it's also reflected in my various sort of sense of labor market reforms. I'm doing a good job of keeping to time here. There's lots I kind of want to say, but I'm moving through. One thing that is in the book that isn't emphasized as much as I've liked, but I've emphasized since, is how much I prefer a jobs guarantee or something like it to wage subsidies. They're both offered. In part, a wage subsidy is a way of bringing in the engaging a certain sort of conservative audience. Whether I have any hope of making inroads there is another, but it's, when I talk about wage subsidies in the book, I say, even if we don't want to adopt them, we need to recognize, as Cass pointed out, this evolution of American tax policy and a variety of other things. We need to realize why the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was such a unmitigated disaster and completely unup to the task at hand, as these conservatives, right? But since the book came out, whether in the New Books Network, interview, or in the Democratize Work panel on the book, I've emphasized jobs guarantee and related things because I'm broadly convinced, and I think Suresh, this is broadly your view, that one of the central components of more inclusive prosperity, one of the central components of making a more just political economy is to do what you can to get as tight a labor market as possible. And I'm broadly convinced that that's an end there. Okay, let's see. What do I have there? Oh, the point about two of you have mentioned, and this is something I probably should have also spent a little more time in the book. Both Ryan and Suresh mentioned care work and implicit care subsidies. This is something that I've kind of gone on and on about in a number of different contexts, but it's not exactly there in the book. But simply put, it's simply true that, and I'm actually going to read my little response here, that the point about teachers and nurses, that gender discrimination played a substantial role in effectively subsidizing these fields. And if we want the care, the needs, what I've interestingly come to see as I was writing the finishing touches of the books and then talking about it since, for example, with on my pandemic ethics podcast with Joan Tronto and others, is the way in which the Just Work playbook looks a lot like a certain set of caring ethics or politics of care literature. And that if we want to meet these basic needs, we need to pay more, right? This implicit subsidy of gender discrimination, now that we don't have that, if you want to fulfill these basic goods, we need to subsidize them much more effectively. They should get more expensive. In other words, we were paying far too little for them before, not to mention that they don't admit of economies of scale. And so, right, so if we're going to meet these care needs, we need to actually put them front and center. And this is why I've been sort of like championing this aspect of the, I guess you would say, second infrastructure bill. Okay, where do I got here? And finally, I'm not going to talk too much about the ins and outs of different policies right now, although it'd be really fun to have that conversation. But sort of more fundamentally, I do think it's important to have the right sort of frame in mind to view these things. And with the right frame, the right sort of frame, if you think of just work or something like it, is a kind of a tool for thinking about the cost benefit analysis of various political reforms. Then reasonable people can disagree about which policies will get there, but at least we're asking the right sorts of questions. Anyway, I have a lot more in my notes here and I kind of went quickly over it, but I wanted to actually keep to my time. And thanks again, everyone, for your amazing comments. It's gonna be a lot to think about, and I look forward to everyone else's.
Thank you. Not familiar with the book, and I hope it gets a wide readership, but let me quickly say, first of all, that when I looked it up on Amazon, I was disappointed to see how expensive it is in terms of reaching a wider public. The Kindle versions is like 35 and 50, the teens. If I want to get my students to buy a book, that's one of the things that they look at. So I'll buy the book. But anyhow, I want to suggest an alternative proposal, even though I haven't read the book, which is that guaranteed full employment, I think, would be necessary and also sufficient, I want to suggest, for a reasonably Smithian well-ordered society. And so we don't need to do anything about guaranteeing work to be meaningful or anything like that. That might be more just than ignoring that. But if we just had full employment, and again, I don't think it even matters. You want to go with wage up subsidies, or do you want to go with guaranteed, government guaranteed employment? Whatever works. But the key is to get to full employment, so that, as Rawls puts it in the one sentence in his book, those who want to work can find it. I've argued, and I continue to try to argue, that Rawls's big mistake was ignoring employment, and he should have included employment as a primary good, which would give you a full employment coming immediately almost out of the original position. And you'd have, it's exactly what Rawls wanted to say, but he didn't say it. And I think Rawls nowadays, if he was alive today, would want to do that maybe. Sam Freeman thinks I'm wrong, and that's why I don't get a lot of traction on this, because he thinks Rawls handled this very well. But I think it was a big mistake of his to just take full employment for granted.
Well, I think, as you could tell from my sort of rushed, I guess, response at the end there, I'm very sympathetic to the importance of full employment and employment, both from a variety of perspectives, both in the sense of how employment might, both in terms of what it means in general, but also the, if you will, the positive impact of employment on bargaining power, hopefully. And share and all of these other things. So I certainly think it has to be a centerpiece. And when I wrote the book, so I made this sort of like, here's a lot of different policy avenues we might take, right? We might just, first, the most important thing is to get the frame right, or broadly right. And to identify a somewhat feasible politics, even if it's hopeful, right? I mean, it's easy to just look at American politics and say, no chance, polarization, all these, that we live in different realities, right? Adam Tooze, and I mean, also as people, right? I mean, I'm broadly sympathetic to some of the concerns that, like we've got a breakdown of elite leadership, and we need, sometimes it feels like American politics looks like, help us enlightened elite, your only hope, because our democratic politics can't get there. But I want to make clear, when I'm making all these different policy proposals, they're not meant to all be adopted at once. They're different avenues you might take if you have a frame, right? Because I felt compelled to say something about what could be done and then how it might be accomplished. But I think it's fair to say that something like a jobs guarantee or full employment is really high up into my sense of first best policy tools for given the frame that I've suggested. I'm not sure I'd go so far as to say it would solve every issue related to that. I think there's other things, but yeah, I'm sympathetic to it. So I appreciate the comment.
All right, Joseph Heath.
Oh, hi, thanks. So yeah, I did. I managed to read the book. I should say, yeah, it was. I looked it up. It was very expensive to buy, but then I went to my library and downloaded it for free. So it's hard to make money selling books these days. You can see why. Anyhow, the thing I learned from the book, like the kind of global lesson, I guess, abstractly from it, is that in philosophy we often formulate these extremely demanding normative principles, like egalitarianism, this kind of stuff, like difference principle, but that, it doesn't actually require these extremely demanding and therefore more controversial principles in order to engage in pretty, productive and trenchant critique of a lot of things going on in American society. And so I think what the book for me illustrated is how you can actually start with a bunch of, weak, normative principles that are far more not weak in a bad way, weak in the sense that likely to attract a really, really broad agreement and still get really considerable traction in talking about the current state of affairs in the United States. So I just wanted to mention that was, I thought was, and also the really useful contribution of the book is to just show how much work you can do with a set of very undemanding normative principles. So I just wanted to actually talk about just like a politics thing, which is that there's an omission in the book that I find really always surprising. So as a non-American, one of the things that I find kind of astonishing about the United States is the radical inequality that exists in public educational funding from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Right. So the fact that you can have school districts. So this idea that you don't spend enough on education in the United States is simply false. Right. The United States spends a shocking amount of money on public education and gets astonishingly poor results from it. And there's also been significant increases in the level of funding. The Americans, the United States is not bad at throwing money at education. The United States is very bad at getting results out of the money that it invests in education. Some of that has to do with radical unevenness in the way that money is invested. So there are public schools in America where every kid gets a free iPad on the day that they show up. And then other public schools a mile down the road where, like the teachers having to pay to buy chalk and stuff like that to write on the blackboard. And so, one of the, huge differences between the United States and other Western countries is the fact that there isn't equalization within the public school system. And it seems like especially if you're worried about fair equality of opportunity, that low-hanging fruit is simply to equalize per pupil spending within public education, like every other country does, right? Now, some insight, I think, into why, I'm always sort of surprised that this isn't more prominent. So I was really struck by it when reading Elizabeth Anderson's book on integration, right? The imperative integration, where when she looks at school integration, racial integration, a lot of her arguments are actually economic arguments, that she's worried about underfunding of schools in predominantly Black neighborhoods. But of course, it's a lot easier to move money to students than it is to move students to money, right? And the issue, so then the obvious question is, well, why not just equalize funding? And it actually comes up only once in the book. And she says, yeah, of course, one could equalize funding. She says, but there was a court case that went forward where they tried to persuade the court that it was unconstitutional to not fund all students equally. And that lost. Therefore, it's dead letter, right? And then so in other words, her intuition is that the reason we're pursuing racial integration of schools as a proxy for economic equalization is that courts are willing to impose racial integration, but courts were not willing to impose equal funding, right? And so she doesn't really say anything about it, but I actually thought that was kind of revealing of a background intuition, which is that how have American liberals been pursuing their egalitarian agenda over the last 30 years? And it seems to be predominantly the way American liberals have been pursuing this agenda has been by relying on the courts to advance that agenda. And they have not been trying to use the democratic mechanism, right? They haven't been trying to build the kinds of constituencies that would actually, create public support for egalitarian projects. Right, so I thought that offhand comment by Anderson, I thought was perhaps, maybe I'm just making this up, but it seemed to me that was revealing of a kind of underlying intuition about political strategy that I think is really profoundly, misguided. And that in a democracy, you have to build democratic support for these things. And there are a lot of arguments that could be advanced about equal funding of public schools that would have, broad resonance in the population. So yeah, that's just that political comment I thought about, where there's other issues that could be tackled. The only sort of, I want to say a second thing, and that is that I did find consistently throughout the discussion that in my mind, when we talk about inequality, what's happening with the top 1% is really a different story from what's going on in and around the median income and with median wages. and that there are, in certain sectors, there are connections between them, but often there just aren't connections between the two of them. And there are many countries in which what's been going on with median income and is really like unconnected from what's going on with, I mean, so not every country has experienced the same runaway income at the top 1%. And so often when one talks about average gains, it actually winds up being incredibly confusing, because when you look at the average, it blends together those two stories in a way that's quite, like that obscures more than it reveals. So for example, if you look at the wealth gap between Black and white Americans, right? Some huge fraction of it is just a portion of what the 1% has. So if you factor out the 1% and then you look at the racial wealth gap, it's significantly different, simply because, Bezos and Musk and stuff, I mean, like the 1%ers are overwhelmingly white, and they also have just spectacularly large amounts of income, enough to skew the average distribution. So yeah, I just thought that with inequality, that and the winner take all thing seems to really focus issues on the 1%. But there is also a kind of winner take all story going on in terms of what's happening with median income as well. But there's a lot of other factors like technology and trade and stuff like that. So I just wanted to suggest that I think that it's more important than I think the book makes clear to separate those two stories and to treat them differently. Also, specifically, if you want to talk about predistribution, you need really different policies to address those different kinds of inequalities.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. Thanks, Joe. Thanks for buying the book. I feel like I'm not going to be in a good position to defend the cost of the book, as you can probably imagine. I tried my best to get it as cheap as possible. If it was $5, but I'm always sending off codes, so your students can always get it for $31. That's the maximum anyone should ever pay for the book. If you email me, and in fact, I'll probably, I can't, this is being recorded. Okay, so I'll always give you a code. It'll always be maximum $30. And if you email me, I'll maybe send your students a check for a couple dollars extra, just to because I don't like it either, but I don't see that money. So unfortunately, I don't quite understand academic book publishing and why it works that way, except for the fact that a lot of people aren't actually making that much money. It's just okay. Okay. So, I mean, one thing, the winner take all language, even back when I started writing the book, I sort of went back and forth between how much I wanted to use it, in part because it captures some of what I'm talking about, but not everything, right? So like there's a big difference between the top explosion of wealth at the top, and you could argue that they're related or not, the explosion of wealth at the top and declining absolute mobility, right? So declining absolute mobility is a central aspect of this transformation in society, right? And that isn't just about what's at the top, right? Another aspect of winner take all society is growing insecurity, right? That need not be about the wealth at the top. But I definitely take your point in the sense that I think it's interesting. I think there too often anyway, the political discourse will be like, you have this runaway people at the top and that's a problem. And then it'll conflate averages and medians. And I think that's a point well taken. I think there's also like more work to be done in thinking about how it is and or is not relevant that a small percentage, how much do people care? There's some of this in chapter 2, right? How much do people care that the wealthy people are massively unconscionably wealthy? Does that really affect their sense of self, or does it only affect their sense of self insofar as the other stuff's happening? Low absolute mobility, insecurity, declining hope, and so on and so forth. And are they right to see those two connected? And what should a moral philosopher think of? These are interesting questions that are not as explored as much as they might be, and would be really fruitful avenues for future research. Yeah, the educational equality thing. I mean, I do think that you're onto something. I don't know how much it applies to Anderson, but I do think you're onto something. There was a certain generation of American liberal that was very comfortable with the courts doing stuff, and they had very positive experience with the courts. That doesn't reflect much of American history of what courts usually do, and the Supreme Court usually does. I'm not sure if that fits Anderson or not, but it definitely is there. I think increasingly there's very few people on the, however you want to define the left in the United States, that that continue. Well, I guess maybe some of the discourse, maybe some of the legal and political philosophy might still look this way, but I think most people have given up on the courts as being the fundamental progressive tool of American politics. Anyway, a lot of other things going on in your comments, but and if you have any other comments, send them to me. I'd love to read them. But thanks for reading the book and thanks for coming.
Matt Bennett.
Thank you. I want to say first, before my question, thank you for the book. I've been familiar with it. I think since it came out, I think I bought it pretty much straight away. So I was very happy to see that this session was being organized for this afternoon. It's been very valuable work for my own research. So yeah, thank you very much for this. I have nonetheless kind of a critical question or a little bit of a worry. It's a methodological worry that I don't think has really been addressed in the comments so far. So I was just wondering what you were going to make of this. So as I understand it, these normative principles of just work and fair race, they are constrained by something of a realist constraint in the book. You're responding to the social science data that we have on US popular attitudes towards distribution and towards some of the distinctive forms of 21st century inequality that are the main themes of the book and the winner takes all society. So I'm wondering whether it's not entirely implausible that some features of those same popular attitudes could be part of that same historical development that you're responding to in the book from a Smithian well-ordered society, or from at least a US society where distribution looks very different, say mid-20th century to now, to a very different form of distribution and a winner-takes-all society, because I think there are ways of telling stories about changes in popular attitudes over that time, or at least a kind of development of particular sort of moral codes that go hand in hand with the institutional changes and the labor market changes and the political economy changes that happen in that same period too. So particularly prominent examples might be things like popular attitudes towards welfare and the kind of concepts that get created to paint welfare recipients, for example, in certain ways, the idea of a welfare queen, or kind of category of this kind of lazy, feckless, undeserving poor, that features very prominently at certain parts in that history and politics of the late 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and what have you. So I'm just wondering whether one might be worried that if we're constrained too much by popular attitudes towards these things as they are now, then we might be buying into the same kind of set of problems that the book is trying to move us away from. Now, the winner-takes-all society is just as much a matter of these popular attitudes as it is the inequalities in the labor market and what have you that you do address in the book. So I'm just wondering what you would make of that.
Yeah, I mean, let me know if I'm not answering your particular question or concern here. I talk about, I have a section of the book, is the book too conservative, right? Because and I look at like a sort of leftist critique of American public philosophy and a libertarian critique of public philosophy, which I talk, both of which are, I argue, are very out of whack with widely held views of American public philosophy of markets, right? And I say, is it too conservative? And I make a kind of case as to why I endeavor to meet citizens where they are. And it's partly it is a practical politics point. You're more likely, even with all the obstacles to building political coalitions across people who live in alternative media universes and everything, shared values are more likely to be, but there is a kind of recognized, but also I think there's power in those shared values. But I mean, I think one could just say that this calls for a different sort of thing. I mean, one thing that I definitely agree with, and that I talk about in the book, that anybody who thinks of American values as a kind of fixed, or any context is a kind of fixed in whatever thing, is making an obvious mistake, right? You can try and, I'm not going to use the various philosophy language about supervenience. You can find overlaps and whatever, but in part of what I'm saying is that there's a huge basket of things that count as American values. Some values are more relevant or are more under threat in certain contexts, right, and need more attention. And in some cases, if we have certain values and we still have them, we need to rethink what it means to live according to them in a different political and economic world, right? So I feel as though that's kind of in line with what you're saying. But again, like a certain sort of radical libertarian or a radical, Marxist, I guess, or what, is probably just going to be unsatisfied with this kind of, contextual, comparative, incremental, somewhat, I guess you would say, internal critique, internal argument. And I'm happy to have someone come at me like that, and even more so to say similar things and maybe be part of a kind of broad political coalition. But I mean, I think that that's a reasonable critique. I think in order to make sense of which critique, one would have to think about just what's wrong with the picture and why, and just what needs to replace it and how could it replace it. But yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. And thank you for reading the book.
Thank you.
Lily Pitcher.
Hi, probably for some context, I should say I'm an undergrad PPE student from the UK, and I haven't read the book, but I came along to kind of learn something new, and I'm really intrigued, and I now will read the book, so thank you. But yeah, so the kind of reason I came along is I'm writing my undergrad dissertation on the interaction between American exceptionalism and far-right violent extremism in the US. And exceptionalism was something that I think Jonathan Wolff picked up in his critique, and you've kind of talked about a lot about American values and things like that. So it's just more that I'm a bit curious about what you kind of think the interaction between the American dream in the 21st century is, and kind of the ideology of exceptionalism, and how the two kind of interlink. Thank you.
Lily, thank you so much for coming and for your great question. Could you say a little bit more about the sense in which you mean American exceptionalism here? Maybe just a few sentences, and then I think I could probably give a better answer.
So I've probably a lot less well read than the people here, but kind of what I've understood exceptionalism as so far is kind of rooted in the concept of America as the exception, the kind of the economic military prowess. And then kind of what I've found from my research is that has inspired that kind of ideology that the US is the best, or in some people, that the US is the best, and therefore we should kind of work to regain America's exceptional status, because I think a lot in the past, a lot of the concept is rooted in the divine covenant that was present when America was formed, and it's kind of God's chosen people. And I think a lot of the ideology of exceptionalism is kind of making the most of that, and fulfilling those kind of duties, things like immigration, how America as exceptional, what does that mean for its economic status and things like that. So I think kind of, I would say exceptionalism in terms of America's power and the duties that people think that gives the country, and how does that mean that America is exceptional and America as the dream, if that makes sense.
No, exactly. Yeah, I thought that's what you meant. I should have taken notes while you said that, because you also gave me a wonderful opportunity to respond to a couple other things. But first, about exceptionalism, I'm not making a claim about American exceptionalism. I know that's not what you're asking. You're asking how does it lead to the right? But I mean, I'm comfortable if someone wants to be motivated by thinking, we can really do great things here. And we have maybe done some great things and we need to do better. If someone's motivated by that impulse, then I think that, okay, well, if I can appeal to those people, then that's fine. I don't really think that. I mean, I think in the academy, you often get this, you get a kind of an alternative, like, why can't, there's this universal restraint among a certain people on the American left, which is like, why can't we just be like Norway or Sweden, and that or Denmark, right? And that sort of thing. I don't really have a view, or at least a view I can stake out in this context about the relationship between this exceptionalism and the right. But you did give me a nice opportunity to mention two things in response to Ryan that I didn't get to in my sort of flurry of responses. So I hope you don't mind if I take the liberty to use them. But in addition to emphasizing the book, the importance of subsidizing, if you will, care work. And why I think in particular, a central policy plank. It was interesting, actually, Ryan. I don't think that was on your slide, but it sort of this one of the central tools, I think, for the Just Work Policy Playbook is funding for early childhood education and publicly subsidized daycare from a variety of different perspectives. And so that's something that I think is central. But with respect to immigration, it's an interesting, the question is, I think I tend to come more how, I think Danny Roderick put it this way. I think it's important to understand the way in which various forms of immigration can impact local labor markets in a way that people, on the left or in libertarian don't always deal with very well in terms of the economics and the politics. But I think overwhelmingly more open, freer borders will just be big productivity gains. So I think immigration policy would have to change dramatically for the impact on just work to overall be negative. And so American exceptionalism is in no way dependent upon the certain sorts of people are here right now. Now, how much that plays into a role, I probably can't contribute to your thesis that much, although I'd be happy to read anything. I hope that answers your question in at least some modest approach way. And again, thank you so much for engaging.
Thank you.
All right. So thanks so much to everyone for coming. Thanks to Josh for the book and for his presentation of the central ideas and responding to everyone's questions and comments. And thanks to our three critics as well. So we have a couple more events. If anyone's at the American Philosophical Association meeting in Vancouver, we have a session with a couple of talks, one by Valerie Soon on freedom of association and another by Johan Himmelreich on governance of artificial intelligence. That's going to be late Saturday night. That'll be at the in-person at the APA. And then I believe April 29th, we have another workshop, Matthew Adams from Indiana and Johan Himmelreich, who are going to give a paper called The Regress Problem for Experiments in Living. So look for emails and notices from PPE on that. So we'll finish up there, and thanks so much to everybody for participating today.
Thank you, everyone.